This episode of Keys to the Shop is brought to you by Prima Coffee. Whether it's espresso machines, manual brewing devices, or general coffee shop needs, they seek to pursue the most innovative coffee products, both domestic and abroad, to offer their customers. Find out more at prima-coffee.com. This is Keys to the Shop, episode 57, SOPs for the win. Well, hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Keys to the Shop. My name is Chris DeFurio, your host for the show, and this podcast is dedicated to giving you insights, inspiration, and the tools you need to grow as a coffee service professional, and I'm happy to have you along today. I have another solo episode for you today, and we're going to be talking about SOPs. That stands for Standard Operating Procedures, and this is something that was requested a few times by listeners to the show, so thank you to those of you who have asked about SOPs. You know, way back in episode 7, which was back in January when this show was first getting started, went over some stuff about checklists. It was called checklist, or what was it called? The 4 Keys to an Effective Checklist. And, you know, this was one of the elements of an effective checklist. We mentioned SOPs, and in the requests, you know, coming from people who are in charge of writing SOPs, writing the procedures that create an environment where a shop can be successful. And I can't wait to get into this with you because we're going to talk about what they are, understanding why they're necessary, how to create SOPs. We're going to talk about how to institute and enforce SOPs in your shop. I think this is going to be a pretty useful episode for you all. And even if you're not in charge of creating these procedures for the cafe, you know, maybe one day you'll open your own store, or if you're a barista now and you might become a manager, I think the information here will be helpful for you at some point, if not right away. Now, before we get into all of that, though, we do want to thank our sponsor here at Keys to the Shop, Prima Coffee. Now, Prima Coffee is a specialty coffee equipment supplier, and they're based out of Louisville, Kentucky, right here where I'm based. And from the beginning of their company, they've set out to make the best brewing equipment available to the general public. And their focus is on curating the best equipment for every need, from grinders to espresso machines, under-counter fridges. You think of something in the cafe that you need to function properly, Prima probably has it. And you can go to their website and check out more of what they have to offer at prima-coffee.com. They've got a lot of resources, a lot of information, and they put a lot of thought and time into what they sell you. So you know it's going to be good stuff. They put a big emphasis on having expertise to help their customers get the right gear to fit every situation. And I really do. I vouch for these guys. I think they're great. And if you work with Prima Coffee, I think you'll think they're great too. So go to prima-coffee.com, reach out to them, tell them I said hello. And my thanks to Prima Coffee for their support of Keys to the Shop and their support of the coffee community by providing us the tools we need to do our jobs well. All right, so SOPs. Now, when we first hear about SOPs, we don't really think about something that is exciting. In fact, we think it's kind of boring, depending on who you are. But the truth is that they are really boring, kind of. Not everything that we do in coffee is going to be exciting, but there are certain key requirements for a cafe. There are certain key elements that, if they're not in place, they don't facilitate the more exciting things. You know, checklists and standard operating procedures are one of those critical areas of a cafe and of your daily work that if it's not really done well, then you can't succeed as much as you could if they were done well or if they were in place properly. Your shop needs order. So yeah, this might seem boring and dry, but you know, bear in mind that well-communicated standards and good communication is one of the first and best ways to build trust with your staff. and also to care for them and the customer. So yeah, you might have to grit your teeth a little bit as you're choosing what bullet point format to use for your SOP, but in the end, you're going to see the kinds of things that the standard operating procedures will provide for you and your staff. So if you don't have a good set of SOPs in your store, it's not like the Wild West. I'm not saying that, but a lack of defined standards does leave a lot of room for interpretation. So one person might do a task differently than the next. And that might not be a problem in the immediate, but over time, people drift farther and farther away from the same type of work. And then you'll get comments from customers and experiences that show you that things are going differently than they should. So people that don't like to go to your store at a particular time of day because the music is just crazy at that time, or they like to go when their particular barista is working because they make the best cappuccinos or whatever. Little signs that there are inadequacies in the standard operating procedures in your cafe. You might be a small cafe. So let's say you're small enough that by turning around and talking to the person next to you, you've just had a staff meeting. And putting in place a standard operating procedure or a manual seems like overkill. It seems like too corporate, too organized, and maybe it threatens an idea of organic and communal work in your coffee bar. Or you could be a large company and you have to call a meeting a month or two in advance, and your temptation is the opposite. It's not to not put SOPs in place. In fact, it's mainly to rely upon SOPs too much, rely upon the documents, and you lose the people part of the equation. Now, what we hope to accomplish here is a middle ground, which says the documents are meant to serve the people. They're just tools. That's all an SOP is. Organizing our expectations on paper for tasks that we want done well. So once again, without codified standards on paper, you're going to end up in a situation where staff start to interpret the same item, the same task, in different ways, even though it was explained the same way to each person, because there is not a well-defined and detailed plan with how to do it. Now, if you do have an SOP in place, what you get from that is consistency, and you get a process for implementing different degrees of improvement. So you can edit that thing. You can create version 2 from it. Version 2 of a conversation is just confusing, right? So if you say, well, I changed my mind, I don't want you to do dishes that way, it's going to take a long time for everybody to get on board. But if you have a dish SOP version 1 and then you change it, reprint it, and show people, there's a common reference point for everybody. It's somehow easier for people to latch on to. So no matter what, you're going to need to institute some standard operating procedures in your cafe. So the question is, how do you write an effective SOP? So the first thing that you're going to want to do here is describe the purpose of the SOP and then outline the impacted areas. So the point in describing the SOP and its purpose gives you an idea of what the goal is. What is the goal of writing a procedure for doing dishes? And that could just be one sentence. It can be a paragraph. If it's something that has more value to you as a company, if it's one of your core values, every turn when you communicate, it's helpful to infuse your language with the why and the point. And it helps you in particular, even if it doesn't make it onto the SOP, like the barista reads it, it helps you in your mind define, for yourself, what is important about what you're doing. Because like we said in the beginning, this can be kind of dry and boring sometimes. especially because there are so many areas that would require some procedures to be written down. And it motivates and inspires us to think about the long-term impact of the process of the organizing of this procedure. So do that. It doesn't have to be long. And then think about the areas that are going to be impacted by this SOP. So let's go back to dishes because that's an easy one. If you're washing dishes in a cafe that also bakes its own baked goods every morning, then you might be required to wash dishes that are going back to the kitchen. And at a certain point in the day, the kitchen might need dishes urgently. And in the documents, in your procedures, you're going to have in there what particular items need to be prioritized at what time. For instance, if it always happens that at 10 a.m. you run out of plates that people were using for a particular type of muffin or something, and the kitchen needs those, then you can write that into the SOP. That's easy. Without thinking ahead of time, preemptively, about the areas that this task impacts, it's going to be hard to write something that's effective when you haven't considered all that it affects. So list the areas of the cafe that it's going to be impacting. So that's the first thing. Outline the purpose of this SOP. How does it fold into your company's values? What is the point? What's the goal of this thing? Then, what are the areas that are impacted? How so? Number 2, who is responsible for doing this? Now, when I say who is responsible for this, I don't necessarily mean a person in particular. Oftentimes, it's a position, like the opener or closer, would be responsible for certain types of SOPs. And there's a couple of types of SOPs. There's ones that have a lot of tasks involved in succession. Things like breaking down the espresso machine has a lot of tasks involved, but it's one procedure. So that SOP can be assigned to a closer, whereas dishes ends up being just one SOP for everybody. If you're an opener, mid-shift, closing, it doesn't matter. If you're doing dishes, you follow the SOP. So there are these universally applied standards of SOPs, and then there are procedures that involve lots of tasks that are dedicated to a particular position. So think about who it is that this is for and determine what type of SOP it is. Is this one of those SOPs that is for a time of day or a position, or is this a forever and always, no matter who you are, you do it this way? So that's number 2. The third thing is you have to bear in mind the rules that come into play with what you're doing. And what I mean by rules is not just your own standards, because no matter how detailed you are or how finicky you might be about the tasks, that doesn't matter if it's in contrast to a standard that is enforced on you by an outside governing body. For example, there is OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. They're going to have standards that you need to abide by if you're doing business. Depending on your type of business, certain things will and won't apply. And then there's your local health department, which is the one that we are used to working with mostly, and the ones who give us the A or the B or the C, whatever it is that you've got in your cafe right now, hopefully an A. But there are things that they're going to tell you that you have to do. You have to be aware of these things. Like, do you have the proper level of sanitizer in your 3-bay sink? Do you have your consumable items or related items 6 inches off the floor? You know, for us, it's 6 inches off the floor. And you have all of these little standards, like, are your thermometers pulled to the very front of the fridge? And does every refrigerator have a thermometer? And is it reading 41 degrees or below? And it goes on, and you have to know what those regulations are. Your health department has a place where you can go and find out all of these rules and regulations. And in the notes, I've linked to OSHA's website, where there are rules and regulations, as well as a website that gives you links to all of the health departments in the U.S. I think it's all the health departments. Like, you click on a state and it shows you what health department there is and you go there. If you're not already aware of what your health department's website is, and I have no idea why you wouldn't be aware of that, but if you've been tasked with creating a standard operating procedure by the owner of the company, for instance, they may know about these regulations, but maybe they're not telling you about the regulations, and it's up to you to make sure that you're looking those things up. This is a link that'll take you to that health department's website. So anyway, when you're writing the SOP, you have to be aware of different regulations, because you don't want to write something that's instructing baristas to do things that are against the rules. Because when an inspector comes in, they're going to find it, they're going to dock you points. You might be giving somebody an instruction to do something that's unsafe for them or for the customers. So go and find out what those outside sources say you have to do. What are the rules that you have to infuse into your SOP? Sometimes they're not going to have anything to say about it except be clean. Other times there are very strict numbers and ranges and standards that you have to abide by, and you want to make sure that your SOP has those included in it. The next thing you want to do for your SOP, after you have given it its purpose, outlined the impacted areas, and determined what type of SOP is it and who does it apply to, now you've looked up those regulations from OSHA or from your health department, you're aware of what those are, and now you got to figure out what the proper tools are to do the job. So list out what type of sponges, what type of mop or broom or cleaning tool is necessary to do the job properly. There might be some regulation on what you can and cannot use in terms of materials, but by and large, you're going to be trying to pick something that's going to work best for your baristas, for your staff. Don't cheap out with some kind of sponge that disintegrates. Make sure you're getting something that's ergonomic, that is available and can be replaced easily if it breaks, because it will, and you'll have to replace it. Just list the tools needed for the job and then move on to describing the process of using those tools. So number 4 is that you need to list the tools out that you need to do the job well. Now, number 5 is now time to put the process down on paper. We've done all this research on the why behind the procedure. We've done all this research on what the standards are, what the regulations are, what the tools are for this job. And now it's going to be a step-by-step process that you need to walk the barista through to create this clear expectation for the job. Each step should be detailed, but use simple language. Be thorough when you're doing this. Don't think that short sentences equals simple. Because if you skip steps because you're afraid people won't read everything, or they're insulted that they have to have it detailed out to them, I guarantee you're going to have to spend more time clarifying on the back end questions that could have been answered by better crafted language in the document. So don't skip on the details. Think through, how could this possibly get messed up? How could somebody take this and misconstrue it? You have to do the work of imagining the ways that people might be confused and then solving that problem for them initially by writing it out. So when you're using that kind of language that circumvents these problems, you do things like, don't say, just wipe down the espresso machine. That's real simple. It sounds simple. Wipe down the espresso machine. But when you come in the morning and somebody, quote unquote, wiped down the espresso machine and it looks like it's never been wiped down, there's all these streaks everywhere. There's coffee grounds that are stuck to it because they used a towel that had been previously damp but was next to the grinders, and now it's on the machine and it's just gross looking. Maybe there's some syrup on it. Did they wipe down the espresso machine? Well, yeah, they did. They totally did. And who could fault them for the uncommunicated standard that you had in your head, but was not on paper. It was not detailed for them. And this is especially true of a new barista. They're going by the letter of the law. And to them, it looks fine, especially when it's wet. You can't tell that the streaks are going to form and it's dark in the cafe at a closing shift. You have got to say something more like, clean the espresso machine with a clean, damp towel so there are no streaks when dry. I mean, that could be even better. And we could sit here and craft that so that there's no question what's expected. But the point is, you want to write it in such a way that there's really no wiggle room for misinterpretation. And so what that means is when somebody messes up, and everybody will mess up, and that's fine. We're all learning. We all make mistakes and we miss something. We can point to the clear language and the clear instruction of the SOP and say, now remember the X, Y, Z, do it this way, etc. Right? Now you've got a leg to stand on. So every step has to be that way. Now, when you write the language, when you write the step-by-step process, there are things that you're going to want to infuse into those sentences that reinforces the values of your company. So the purpose of this cleaning a cafe or bussing a table, right? If there's an SOP on bussing a table, then you could say something like, once the table has been bussed, clean the surface with a damp microfiber towel using the tabletop sanitizer and dry the surface with a dry towel so the table is immediately available for guests. So what I tried to do with that sentence was I used language that was very specific, like the microfiber towel. I used language that reinforced the type of regulations that might be put on me by the health department by describing what sanitizer to use or what liquid am I going to use to clean this table? Well, it's the sanitizer, and that's the one that we're supposed to use, okay? And then the next thing I did was I tried to infuse the purpose into the sentence. What is the purpose of doing that task? Is to provide a table immediately for the guest. Having a few of these sentences in the SOP is really helpful because it answers questions before they're asked. It describes and reinforces the purpose and process each step of the way. So if you can infuse your SOP with those things, I think you're going to have a really great procedure. Okay, so now we are at a place where you've got the list of how to go from just starting the task, number 1, all the way down to, say, step 10, where you should say something like, now fill in the blank, the dishes are done, or now you have cleaned the table. Because then you have defined for people what done looks like. So instead of ending on the last task, just bookend that with it's done or this is now complete. So to recap, when you sit down to write an SOP, when you sit down to write the standard operating procedure for whatever it is, whatever task, you want to detail for yourself or for others what the purpose of this task is. What areas does it impact and in what ways? Then you have to find the rules from outside sources like OSHA or the health department and figure out how they impact that task. Certain tasks may not have any regulations, but others are just chock full of them. And then you want to find out what tools are needed for the job. And if you don't have the tools that you need for the job, then you have to find them and make sure that they're not so specialized that you can't replace them quickly because they're going to get broken. But don't cheap out on something that is just going to disintegrate or break easily. Make sure they're good tools to do the job properly. Then, using all that you've come to know about this task, write the step-by-step, the way that this job is done in your mind to perfection, with detailed sentences that infuse the purpose, they infuse the regulations, like health regulations and things like that, and they're very detailed So it answers questions before they can be asked. And when you're done with all of this, all the way down at the bottom, you should just say, you have done the dishes, you have cleaned the cafe. That gives everybody the idea of when they're done and if they've done a good job. So now that we've got a standard operating procedure, and now we have to enforce it. Now we have to put it into place. So the first thing that you do is you communicate the SOP in person by explaining the need and the relevancy and the impact of it. Not just the impact for the store, but the impact for the people. When you're working in a coffee bar, you really want to know how something is going to benefit you. This is just human nature. I want to know how what I'm doing is going to benefit me in some form. Now, we can be as altruistic as all get out, but I guarantee you, if there is nothing redeeming in terms of, what is this gain for even just us as a team, if you don't know what that is, you're not going to get as much buy-in. You need to figure out, how does this make life better for the baristas? How does this make their job easier, more rewarding? How is it relevant? Maybe how does it solve a problem? You could be writing this because everybody has asked you to. So that's really easy. Then, hey, this is going to be easier because you all are asking for it. And so communicate in person by explaining the need for this document, the need for organization, the relevancy, and its impact on the people and on the customers. The next step is you want to demonstrate this. So get behind the espresso machine, break it down, show step by step what it looks like to follow this step-by-step process. Now, sometimes this could backfire because maybe you haven't actually thought through the process of this written document as well as you should have. And in the process of demonstrating, you come to a point where you realize, oh, golly, this is really impractical. So you don't want to have that happen in front of people. So just make sure you go through the motions yourself and make sure that it makes sense what you're asking people to do, and then demonstrate it for them, okay? So yeah, make sure you do that, but demonstrate it for them and then have them do it. Coach anything that needs to be coached. So once you have everybody doing this process well, now you can just watch and see how people do in the real life setting. So you watch for people doing things well and not so well. So if you catch people doing things that they're skipping steps, now all that hard work you did to make sure the list was detailed is going to pay off, because you can point back to the document and you can say, okay, so remember this one step where we were when I showed you and they actually did it. Immediately, most people are going to say, oh, right. I just forgot. I'm sorry, because people are doing dishes under duress most of the time in the cafe. They're wondering if somebody's going to call their attention away from the dishes and they're not quite done yet, or whatever it is. Like, I've got to drain the water from here because it's like freezing cold and I'm not done, but I have to, you're never really operating within a particular task on a coffee bar with 100% focus. That's why these details and communication and observance on your part as a supervisor or a manager is super important, because you're making up for that. That's just the nature of the work and present leadership. If people are doing it well, though, if they're doing everything that you've asked them to do, you can't just be happy with that. You have to reinforce it. You have to praise people for good work. You've got to recognize that they're doing what you ask them to do. If you don't recognize people, even for little things, they're going to tell a story to themselves in their mind about how it's not actually that important to you. It's not that important to the company, and therefore, why should it be important to me? Because right now, I'm about to lose my mind, and I don't see the value of carrying through with this to the T. Okay, so to get buy-in to the details, you not only need to be able to reinforce when things go wrong the right way, but you need to reinforce and praise people for doing it the right way and not just take it for granted. which is one of the cardinal sins of leadership, is not recognizing people for good work as often as we do recognizing the work that's lacking. So that's how you institute an SOP. Communicate it in person, show people the document. In fact, you can give them a copy of it, demonstrate it for them, show them how to do it, have them do it in front of you, coach them, watch them throughout the days that follow, and coach them then as well. Show them where they are missing tasks, and when they're doing it right, praise them for doing it right. Show them that you are focused on this particular thing. And over time, over the course of weeks or a month or so, you won't have to do that as much because it's not impossible. It's not possible for you to praise the work or coach the work of every single person, of every single task there is on the bar. At some point, this is going to become more habit for the staff. But the initial phase of making this habit is going to require a lot more personal attention. And at that point, after it's become habit, now you've really instituted a standard operating procedure. It's just the way we do it now. Now, this is where we get into trouble too. We've come to a place where we've got this document and it governs how we do a task. And it works until it doesn't work. Equipment changes. You get a new machine. It has new standards. Everyone has to learn how to do stuff differently. Maybe you got one of those fancy automatic tampers. You got a puck press in your shop. Oh, well, now you don't tamp anymore, which can be glorious, but it's going to really mess with your muscle memory. So the flow of your work is going to change, which means your standard operating procedure is going to change. Okay. Maybe standards change around you. The health department says you can no longer have this here, or we now require you to have this amount of sanitizer in your far left bay. Okay. Whatever it is, if standards change and regulations change, then you have to change. Maybe it's just that the actual SOP, even though you went through this process, you could still have missed something. You could still have skipped a step, or something it became to light that nobody thought of, and it has been inadequate for the last 2 weeks, but you've been too busy to see it, and now it's coming to your attention that it needs to change. So let's bear in mind here that even though standard operating procedure sounds like a monolith, sounds like this thing that's just like there and there forever, it needs to be fluid. It has to be flexible. It has to be changeable. It has to serve people. And your business is made up of people. It's this dynamic interaction of different groups of people around a product, and the amount of business you have changes. The type of business you do in the future might change. Your lists and your procedures need to be able to change with it. And that needs to be known up front. That needs to be communicated to the baristas in the team that their input is what drives these standards. If you just dictate from on high without working shifts, then the relevancy of both you and the list is going to go way low. This is a group process if it's going to be effective at all. So the problem we can end up with is, because we don't actually say that to people, because we don't actually communicate that we want to have feedback on these things, people assume that we don't want feedback on these things. And it communicates that there's an inflexibility here. And so people will live for long periods of time with dysfunction and develop some kind of a Stockholm syndrome for dysfunctional standard operating procedures where they don't know, nothing is ever going to change, so we might as well not say anything. Now, I know I've been guilty of this just as much as the next person, but an effective SOP will change over time. said this in the checklist episode back in January. And it's just as true now towards the end of the year, and it will always be true. So what do? You have to communicate that, first of all, to your staff. Yes, they are required to follow it. That is absolute. It's not, hey, I want you to question everything that I say. No, I mean, this is the standard operating procedure for a reason. This is something that we want enforced. But if there are better ideas, or if there's a problem, then we will investigate. We are open to it and we want to hear about it. We want to listen to what's being said. You want to be able to ask a barista, how's it going with that SOP? Any questions? When you wait for people to come to you with questions, the chances are that they've been sitting on it for a long time. So ask. Watch what's happening. Ask people questions. Listen for what they're saying. And then determine if there is, in fact, a course correction necessary. Sometimes it's just a quick answer that solves a problem. Other times you really do need to do something about this, like line number 6 on the 20-step SOP for taking care of the retail shelf. Then you just edit the document. You figure out, go through and figure out what it is that's the problem, and simply change the language, right the wrong, change all of the documents to the version 2 of that document, and communicate that change to people. Now you just enforce that. And on it goes. Over time, you'll probably end up with a new version of it. But maybe you won't. Maybe you have refined this thing so it's going to last a long time, and that's great. So how do you choose where to apply this? All that we've talked about today, where do we apply first the standards for SOPs? There are a lot of areas of a cafe that you could focus on, and you could choose from hundreds of different things that need definition. But I would say the first place that you need to look are the places where you already see friction, where you already see bottlenecks. And if you don't see it, then you just take a step back and look to see in the cafe what's happening. Watch for a while. And maybe even ask the baristas and ask the staff, what is going on in the cafe that is causing confusion? Point blank, what's causing confusion? What tasks and processes do you think can be better defined for you? Chances are they're not telling you what they are. You need to ask. There's some good places to start. Let's go back to the idea that SOPs are kind of boring. And as we talk here, I'm under no illusions that these points seem tedious. But in the end, when you infuse them into the way you do things in your cafe, they're going to facilitate the kind of growth that will lead to your success. It'll lead to a feeling of satisfaction that your baristas know that they've done a job well. You know that your baristas have done a job well. And all the time bearing in mind that these are documents and procedures that are put in place to serve the people. So that's it for the show today, and I want to thank the people who reached out and asked me for some more elaboration on the concept of standard operating procedures. I hope that today was helpful and provided some clarity when it comes to standard operating procedures. And if you have any questions for me, if you have any suggestions for future shows perhaps, then you can reach out directly to me by emailing chris@keystotheshop.com. I would love to hear from you. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the show and leave us a rating or review on iTunes. That would be greatly appreciated. Now, the notes for this show are on the resources tab of keystotheshop.com. And there you will find those links that I talked about for OSHA and for the health departments in the United States at least. And at the end, there's a template that you can download and use as the first version of an SOP. Real simple, just 3 boxes with titles that you can use. It doesn't have to be super complicated, but that will hopefully be helpful for you. So again, thank you for joining me today, and go on this week and see where you can improve in your standard operating procedures. and use some of these tips to help you be more successful in the cafe and provide a better base of communication of how things should be done. I think you're going to see a lot of fruit from this when it's applied well in the cafe. So as always, I hope that this episode, as well as every other episode on the show, has given you keys to the shop.